Blood doesn't always roar in your ears. Sometimes it simply goes quiet. Josephine Barrow was on her knees scrubbing the third-floor oak staircase at 11 o'clock at night when she heard the butler's footsteps stop directly behind her. She never got the chance to stand. His hand slid from her shoulder down to her waist and pulled her back against him, while his voice stayed in exactly the same polite register he used for guests in the front hall. "On your feet, Miss Barrow. The floor can wait." She was 27. She had scrubbed those stairs for 4 months, alone, every night, because a line of handwriting in the household duty book called it supplemental work. She didn't push his hand away. She stayed where she was, both hands still gripping the wet cloth, running a calculation she knew so well it no longer required thinking. Her daughter's birth certificate was sitting in this man's desk drawer, along with her social security card and the medical guardianship papers. Without those 3 pieces of paper, no hospital in Rhode Island would let her sign anything, so she stayed where she was, the way she did every other night. Then, from the corridor above, came a footstep so soft it should have gone unheard unless the man walking meant to be heard. Rafael Santoro stood at the top of the stairs, his coat still on his shoulders, as though he had cut a trip short to be there. He didn't shout. He didn't come down. He only looked at the exact place where that hand rested on her, and the hand came away as if it had touched a hot stove. Josie had worked in that house for 4 months. She knew what her employer did for a living, and she knew she wasn't supposed to know it. But what she had no idea of what would take her another 6 weeks to understand was that her job application had never been read by anyone. She had not found her way to that house. That house had found her, long before this night. If you believe a person's dignity has nothing to do with the uniform they wear, leave a like on this story. Share it with someone who needs reminding that they are still seen, and subscribe to walk the rest of these stories with us. 4 months earlier, on an afternoon in early October, Josephine Barrow sat on the edge of a chair in the basement personnel office of Hallow Point Manor and read the contract for the 3rd time, not because she hadn't understood it, but because she was trying to find some line that might allow her to say no. $1,900 a month. Meals included, lodging included, uniforms included, even laundry facilities included. To someone else, it would have been low pay. To her, it was the only number in the world that meant her entire paycheck could be sent away untouched, with nothing deducted for rent, nothing deducted for electricity, nothing deducted for gas for a car she'd sold the winter before. Clause 9 was on the 2nd page, printed in the same size as every other clause, not bolded, with no one there to read it aloud to her. Resident employees weren't permitted to bring young children onto the grounds of the estate. 2 days off each month, to be scheduled by the head steward. She read that clause for a very long time. She thought about how, in a month of 30 days, she would spend 28 of them 40 miles away from her daughter. And she thought about how, if she didn't sign, then by the following month she wouldn't have anywhere left from which to be far away from her child. Then she signed. The price had already been paid before she ever walked through the door. 3 years earlier, she'd never had to weigh choices like that. 3 years earlier, she'd had a rented 2-bedroom house on the west side of Providence, a dining table with 4 chairs even though only 3 people lived there, and a man named Aaron Barrow who left for work at 6 in the morning and came home after dark, his hands always covered in cement dust. He worked on scaffolding. He told her the job was only dangerous for careless men, and he was never careless. He died one September morning, 4 stories above the ground at an office construction site 9 miles from home. They called her at 10:15. She remembered the time because she was halfway through feeding Nell a bowl of porridge. 4 months later, the insurance company sent her a 3-page letter, and all 3 pages existed only to say one thing in different ways. The worker hadn't followed proper safety procedures, and therefore the compensation claim was denied. She read that letter 9 times. She called. She filed appeals. She sat in the hallway outside a law office for 3 hours, only to hear someone tell her that pursuing the case would cost more than she could ever hope to receive. Then she stopped. Over the next 11 months, she lost the house, lost the car, and lost the habit of sleeping straight through until morning. Nell was 3 then. The little girl had been born with a heart that needed to be watched more carefully than the hearts of other children, and that was why, for 3 years, every decision in Josephine Barrow's life had revolved around a single question. Will this keep my daughter's place at the hospital, Mrs. Ruth Gentry, the 71-year-old neighbor in the apartment across the hall, was the one who watched Nell while Josie worked the night shift at a restaurant, then the night shift at a warehouse, and finally the job at Hallow Point. She wouldn't take any money. She only said her home was too quiet, and that a 6-year-old child couldn't possibly be a bother to anyone. Hollow Point Manor stood in Newport with its back to the sea, staffed by 14 servants and ruled by one man who managed all 14 of them with a leather-bound ledger. Everett Crane was 56 years old and had served as head steward to the Santoro family for 22 years. And in all those 22 years, no one had ever heard him raise his voice even once. He had exactly one tone of voice for every person, every circumstance, and every hour of the day, the calm, courteous tone people used when inviting guests to sit in the main parlor. It took Josie about a week to understand that the calmness itself was what made him frightening, because when a man never changed his tone, the person listening could never know when she'd crossed the line. On her second morning at the manor, Crane summoned her to the small office beside the kitchen. He sat behind his desk, opened the leather-bound ledger, and said her personnel file was incomplete. He needed the originals, not copies, because the personnel department in Providence didn't accept copies. He listed each item slowly, as though reading from a menu. Nell Barrow's birth certificate, Nell Barrow's social security card, and the medical authorization and guardianship records, the documents required to prove her sole legal custody and authorization to sign for treatment in any hospital room in the state of Rhode Island. Josie sat motionless for several seconds. She asked why her personnel file required documents belonging to her child. Crane looked up, and he smiled in that same voice that never changed, saying it was a dependent verification policy, that everyone had to submit the same documents, that she wasn't the first person to ask the question. He extended his hand across the desk. Josie looked at that hand. Then she opened her bag, took out the envelope she'd carried with her everywhere for 3 years, and placed it in his palm. The drawer slid shut. The soft click of the lock turning once was almost too quiet to hear, so quiet that it wasn't until much later that she realized how clearly she'd remembered it. 3 weeks passed before Josie understood that the 3 documents in that drawer weren't going to find their own way back to her. She had waited because she was the kind of person who believed procedures took time, and because nothing had happened during those 3 weeks to give her reason to worry. Then Mrs. Ruth called one evening and reminded her that the clinic needed the original medical guardianship record to update its system before the end of the year, and Josie heard herself answer in a perfectly calm voice that she would get it back that week, even as her hands began to turn cold. The next morning, she knocked on the door of the small office beside the kitchen. Crane was sitting behind his desk with the leather-bound ledger already open, as though he hadn't left that chair once in 22 years. Josie said she needed the 3 documents she'd submitted returned to her. She had prepared herself for a refusal, had already thought of 2 sentences she could say in response, had even planned to speak more loudly than usual if she had to. But Crane didn't refuse. He nodded at once and said, of course, they were her documents. No one had the right to keep them, and he said it with his usual unruffled politeness. Then he opened the drawer on his right, took out a printed form, placed it on the desk, and turned it around so she could read it. Request for return of personal documents. He explained the procedure slowly, one step at a time, with such precision that there was nowhere for her to challenge it. The form had to be submitted to the corporation's personnel department in Providence because the file had already been entered into the central system, which meant the original documents were no longer kept at the manor. The average processing time was 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes longer if the request fell during the holiday season. And in the lower right corner of the form was a small blank box requiring the head steward's approving signature, because under internal policy, every request made by a resident employee had to pass through that employee's direct supervisor. He said all of it without hesitating once. Josie picked up the form and read it. It had the company letterhead, a form identification number in the upper left corner, and even a note about document retention periods. It looked entirely real, and perhaps it was. She filled in her name, entered the date, listed the 3 documents, and pushed the paper back toward him. Crane looked at the form but didn't pick up his pen. He said he would sign it when it was convenient. Josie asked when that would be. He smiled and said the manor had guests that week, that she could see for herself how busy everyone was. She remained standing there for several more seconds. She realized she had nothing left to say because he hadn't said no. He hadn't made any false promise, and he hadn't done anything she could describe to another person and have that person nod in agreement that something wrong had happened. He simply hadn't picked up his pen. That was the first time Josie understood that there was a kind of refusal that didn't require the word no. And that kind of refusal was harder to fight than anything she'd faced in the past 3 years. That afternoon, as she passed through the staff corridor, she stopped in front of the weekly assignment board. The leather-bound ledger never left Crane's desk, but a printed copy was posted there each week, with the names of the 14 employees arranged in 14 separate rows. On her row, beneath the night shift column, there was a new handwritten entry in black ink, the lettering small and neat. 3rd floor stairway, 11 o'clock at night. Every night. Beside it were 3 words in parentheses. Additional assigned duty. She stood looking at those words for a long time. No one in the service wing said anything. 2 young women walked past, glanced at the board, then glanced at her, and kept going. No one explained what the additional duty was. No one asked why she was the only one who had been given it. That evening, Josie went down to the kitchen for water after her shift. Marisol Vega was standing at the sink, with both hands submerged in soapy water, scrubbing a large cast-iron pot she had scrubbed at that same hour for years. She didn't turn around. She didn't lift her head. She only said, in a low, even voice that nearly disappeared beneath the sound of running water, that Josie shouldn't sign anything else for him. Josie stopped in the middle of the kitchen. She asked what Marisol meant. Marisol didn't answer. Josie stepped closer and asked a second time. Asked what she had seen. Asked whether she knew something about that form. The woman kept scrubbing the pot with the same steady rhythm, neither faster nor slower, and it was a long time before she spoke one more sentence. She said the pot had to be finished before 10 o'clock, and then she fell completely silent. Josie stood there for another minute before taking her glass of water and going upstairs. On the staircase, she looked back once. Marisol still hadn't turned around, and Josie carried those words with her to the 3rd floor, carried them through every night that followed, without knowing that it wouldn't be until winter that she would understand why a woman who had lived inside that house for 20 years had dared to warn her with only one sentence, and hadn't dared to speak a second. At Hollow Point Manor, there was one rule no one had written down and no one needed to mention, and that rule was Tuesday. One night each week, the east gate opened shortly before 7 in the evening, and Rafael Santoro came home. Josie knew it from her first week there, not because anyone had told her, but because on Tuesday afternoons, everything in that house changed its rhythm. The floors were washed twice instead of once. Marisol prepared fewer dishes but remained at the stove longer. And Crane, the man whose voice never changed, began speaking about a quarter beat more slowly, like someone counting his own footsteps in the dark. Rafael Santoro was 34 years old. He had taken over his father's work at 26, during a winter that, according to the way the people in the house told it, had given no one time to ask whether he wanted it. Josie didn't know the details, and she didn't ask. She knew what the Santoro name meant in Providence. She knew why the cars parked in the courtyard on Tuesday nights all carried license plates from other states, and why the door to the 2nd floor study was thicker than every other door in the house. She knew, and she understood that her job was not to know. What drew her attention to him wasn't power. Over the past 3 years, she had met enough powerful men in personnel offices, law offices, and hospital reception areas, and they all had one thing in common: they talked too much. Rafael Santoro was the opposite. The first time he walked into the kitchen, Josie was standing in the far corner polishing glasses. The sound of Marisol's knife against the wooden cutting board stopped halfway through its rhythm. 2 young maids who had been arguing about switching shifts fell silent. No one greeted him. No one bowed. The room simply went quiet, as though someone had lowered the volume of the entire world, and Josie realized he hadn't asked for it. He hadn't even looked at anyone. He took a glass of water, drank it all, set the glass in the sink, and walked out. It took nearly 10 seconds after the sound of his footsteps had completely disappeared before the knife began moving again. That was the difference Josie would think about many times later. Crane filled a room with his words. Rafael Santoro made a room fall silent simply by entering it. During her first 2 months, she encountered him only twice in ways worth remembering. The first was on a Wednesday morning, when she was dusting a table in the reading room and dropped a crystal paperweight onto the stone floor. It broke into 3 pieces. Crane appeared in less than a minute, as though he had already been standing outside the door, and opened his leather-bound ledger on the spot. $300. He read the amount aloud in his usual calm voice and explained that it was the replacement value listed in the property inventory, that the money would be deducted gradually from her wages over 3 months, and that she had nothing to worry about. Josie stood looking at the 3 pieces of crystal on the floor, and did the calculation in her head, the calculation she always made, the one that measured $300 in the number of weeks Mrs. Ruth would have to pay for Nell's food out of her own pocket. Then footsteps sounded in the corridor. Rafael Santoro passed the reading room doorway without stopping, without turning his head, his eyes still fixed straight ahead. He said only 3 words, his voice low, without the slightest emphasis, as though reminding someone of some small matter they had forgotten. Let it go. Then he disappeared down the hall. Josie looked over. Crane was still holding the ledger, his pen still resting against the page, and for about 2 seconds, his face showed no expression at all. Then he closed the book, bowed his head toward the empty corridor where the man had just passed, and told her she should clean up the mess. It was the first time Josie had ever seen Everett Crane bow his head, and she remembered it, though she didn't yet understand why she was remembering. The second time happened, about 3 weeks later. During her lunch break, she went out and sat on the steps behind the kitchen, the only place on the grounds where the servants were allowed to sit. She opened her phone and looked again at the picture Mrs. Ruth had sent that morning, a photograph of a colored drawing of a house with 3 windows. She didn't smile. She only looked at it, her thumb resting motionless against the edge of the screen. Then she heard gravel shifting and looked up. Rafael Santoro was standing about 10 paces away with his hands in the pockets of his coat, on his way to the car. He had stopped. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the screen in her hand, for exactly 3 seconds. And then his gaze returned to the path ahead, and he continued walking, without asking a question, without greeting her, without showing that he had stopped at all. Josie turned off the screen, slipped the phone into her apron pocket, and went back into the kitchen. She thought it must have been accidental. She thought men like him passed dozens of people every day without remembering a single face. It wasn't until much later, after everything had broken open, that she sat down and wondered why a man who walked so quietly that no one ever heard his footsteps had allowed the gravel to make a sound at the exact moment he stopped behind her. Mrs. Ruth called on a Thursday evening, 9:15, and Josie knew from the very first second that something was wrong, because Mrs. Ruth never called at that hour. Her voice on the other end of the line was very calm, the kind of calm belonging to someone who had written everything down before dialing and was now reading each word back as though taking dictation. Dr. Ellery's clinic had called that afternoon. He had managed to arrange an appointment, but there was only one available day, March 14th, and there wouldn't be another because his schedule was full through the end of summer. If they missed March 14th, Nell's name would be moved to the bottom of the waiting list, and the next closest date anyone had mentioned was in September. Josie stood in the basement corridor, still holding the cleaning cloth she hadn't had time to put down, and listened as Mrs. Ruth finished the last part, the part Josie had already known was coming. The hospital required the originals of all 3 documents before the appointment, so they could update Nell's file under their new system. Mrs. Ruth asked whether she had gotten them back yet. Josie said yes, almost. They were already on their way back. The lie came out smoothly, and the ease of it disgusted her more than the lie itself. She ended the call, stood motionless for nearly half a minute, then went straight upstairs. She didn't sleep that night. She lay on the narrow bed in the staff room and did the familiar calculation, the one she had done thousands of times over the past 3 years, except this time every number led to the same place. There were fewer than 3 months left until March 14th. Even if her request was actually signed, it would still take 6 to 8 weeks, which meant that if Crane picked up his pen tomorrow, everything could still arrive in time, which meant that every day he didn't pick up that pen, the distance between her daughter and September grew a little smaller. The next morning, she waited for him in the corridor outside the kitchen, the place he always passed at 7:15. She had rehearsed the words 3 times in her head, and she spoke exactly as she had practiced, without trembling, without circling around the point. She said she needed to know where her form was, and that she had an absolute deadline of March 14th. Crane stopped. He didn't appear annoyed. He even turned fully toward her, a courteous gesture he used with everyone, and answered in that unfazed tone of his that her request was still in transit. Josie asked what in transit meant, and where it was. He said the files traveled with the internal courier twice each month, and that he couldn't interfere with the schedule of the Providence Personnel Department. She asked whether he had signed it. There was a very brief silence, so brief that someone else might not have noticed it, and then he said that wasn't as important as her understanding the procedure. Josie said she understood the procedure. She said all she needed was one signature, something that took less than 3 seconds, and that she had already waited 3 weeks. Crane looked at her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten her. He only said, slowly, as though explaining something obvious to someone who was slow to understand, that a person in her position should learn patience. Because in that house, patient people stayed a long time, while impatient people usually didn't stay very long at all. Then he wished her a pleasant day and continued walking. Josie remained standing in the middle of the corridor. 2 servants passed by, looked at her, then looked away. Pots continued striking against one another in the kitchen. Somewhere above them, a vacuum cleaner was running. The entire house continued moving according to its proper rhythm. Nothing had broken. Nothing was unusual. No one had just done anything wrong. That was exactly what made her unable to move. She had survived 3 years that everyone said were the worst years of her life. She had read the insurance company's 3-page letter 9 times. She had sat for 3 hours outside a law office, only to be told she didn't have enough money to reclaim what belonged to her. She had moved out of the 2-bedroom house carrying 2 cardboard boxes and a 3-year-old child asleep against her shoulder. Every time, she had managed to stand again because there had always been something left to do. That morning, for the first time in 3 years, she stood beneath the bright lights of a corridor and realized there was nothing left for her to do. There was no door left to knock on, no one left to call, no second form to submit. There was only a man who would never say no to her, and a locked drawer whose key turned so softly. She stood there for a very long time, longer than she realized, until someone called her name from the kitchen, and she went inside to finish her work. That hand left her waist, but no one on the staircase moved. Josie was still kneeling, water dripping from the cloth onto the wooden step and spreading into a dark stain. Everett Crane stepped back half a pace and began to speak, his voice remaining strictly smooth and formal, saying that Miss Barrow was finishing the additional duty assigned to her that evening, and that he had merely happened to pass by to check on her progress. Rafael Santoro didn't answer with a single word. He didn't look at Crane. He looked down at Josie, and when he spoke, his voice was as gentle as though he were asking her to take care of some trivial matter. "Go down to the kitchen." Josie stood up. Her knees had stiffened from kneeling too long, and she had to steady herself against the banister for a moment before she could walk. She went downstairs without looking back, still holding the cloth because she had forgotten to put it down, and she counted 23 steps before reaching the second-floor landing. As she passed it, she heard the study door open and then close. It didn't slam. There was only the soft, clean sound of wood settling into its frame. In the kitchen, Marisol Vega was chopping onions beneath the lamp hanging over the cutting board. She didn't ask why Josie had come down at 11 o'clock at night with a floor cloth in her hand. She only pushed a stool out with the toe of her shoe. Josie sat down. The knife struck the cutting board in a steady rhythm, 3 beats at a time, neither faster nor slower. Then, from the second floor, through the ceiling and the thick doors, came the sound of a chair falling over. Josie jerked her head up toward the ceiling. Marisol didn't lift hers. In a low, even voice that almost disappeared beneath the sound of the knife, she said not to look at the ceiling because it wouldn't help. Josie lowered her eyes. After the chair fell, there came a short, broken gasp, the sound a person made after losing his balance, and before he had time to recover it. Then nothing. There was no shouting, nothing else at all, only silence. And that silence lasted so long that Josie began to hear the refrigerator humming, the wind outside the window, and the sound of her own breathing. Marisol finished chopping the onion, swept it aside, and picked up another. She had done that work for 20 years, and that night she did it exactly as she had on every other night. At one point, without looking at Josie, she told her she should drink some water, that people often forgot to drink water on nights like this. Josie drank. She couldn't remember what the water tasted like. The hands of the kitchen clock crept past 11:20, then 11:40. During all that time, no one came downstairs, no one went up, and no further sound came from the second floor. Near midnight, the wheels of a suitcase began rolling across the stone floor of the corridor. Josie stood before she had time to think. She reached the kitchen doorway just as Everett Crane passed. He was wearing his overcoat, pulling the suitcase with his right hand, while his left arm was pressed against his body in an unnatural way, and he walked with a slight lean. Aside from that, he remained entirely the man she had seen every day for 4 months. His hair neatly combed, his collar straight, not a single mark on his face. He stopped before the main entrance. He turned his head and looked at Josie for exactly 1 second. Then he smiled. It wasn't the smile of a man who had just lost. It was the smile of a man closing his ledger because he had finished recording the day's work, and Josie stood rooted to the spot, watching until the door closed and the sound of the suitcase wheels vanished completely across the courtyard. She turned back toward the kitchen. Marisol had gathered the onions into a large bowl and was washing the knife beneath the faucet. Josie asked whether that meant he was truly gone. Marisol turned off the water, dried her hands on her apron, and for the first time that evening, she raised her eyes to Josie. She looked at her for a long time with an expression Josie couldn't read. Not relief, not fear, but something suspended between the two. Then footsteps sounded on the servants' staircase. Rafael Santoro entered the kitchen. He had removed his coat, and the sleeves of his shirt were neatly rolled to his elbows. He stopped about 4 paces away and came no closer. He didn't ask whether she was all right. He didn't ask how many times it had happened. He only said that Crane wouldn't be coming back, and that beginning tomorrow, she would carry the keys. Josie heard him but didn't understand at first. She asked which keys he meant. Rafe said all of them. Then he looked at the floor cloth still clutched in her hand, studied it for about 2 seconds, and added that from now on, the 3rd floor stairs didn't need to be cleaned at night. Then he walked out. Josie stood in the middle of the kitchen with the wet cloth in her hand. It should have been the moment when she felt the weight lift from her body. But she wasn't thinking about the keys or the staircase. She was thinking about the drawer on the right side of the desk upstairs, the 3 documents inside it, and the man who had smiled at her before walking out the door. At 6 o'clock the next morning, Josie went up to the 2nd floor carrying the ring of keys Walt Osgood had handed her at the kitchen door at 5:30, saying nothing more than that the smallest key opened the study. She unlocked the door. The room looked exactly as it always had. The dark wooden desk in the center, 2 chairs, a desk lamp, the rug beneath the desk. Only 1 chair had been pushed out of its usual place, and someone had set it upright again without sliding it all the way back in. Josie went straight to the drawer on the right. It wasn't locked. She pulled it open. Empty, not hurriedly empty, with no scraps of paper, no abandoned paper clips, no trace of someone gathering his belongings in haste during the night. It was empty in the way a room was emptied by someone who had planned the clearing carefully. She opened the 2nd drawer, then the 3rd, the filing cabinet along the wall, even the document compartment beneath the windowsill. Not a single sheet bearing an employee's name remained. There were no personnel files, no copies of contracts, no request for return of personal documents form she herself had completed 3 weeks earlier. Everett Crane hadn't carried those files out in his suitcase that night. He was far too careful for that. He had already moved them off the estate weeks ago, keeping them as his final line of leverage. Josie sat down in the chair that had been left out of place, rested both hands on the desk, and for several minutes, she couldn't think at all. There were fewer than 3 months left until March 14th, and those 3 documents were now somewhere in a car, inside a suitcase, in the possession of a man whose address she didn't know, whose telephone number she didn't have, a man who had left her with nothing but his name. She stood to leave. Then she saw it. The leather-bound ledger lay on the left corner of the desk, exactly where it had rested for the past 4 months, open and turned face down as though its owner had merely stepped away to fetch a glass of water. He had taken everything else in the room, except the object he had held in his hands every day. Josie understood why. To him, the ledger wasn't evidence. It was a schedule. It contained only names, dates, shifts, and professional notes, the sort of thing any steward in any great house might keep. It was the most harmless object in the room. She pulled it toward her and opened it from the last page. The final page was for the current week. Her name appeared on the 9th line, and in the night shift column were the familiar handwritten words: 3rd floor stairway, 11 o'clock, additional duty. She turned backward. The previous week, the previous month, autumn, summer. The ledger was thick, and the handwriting remained unchanged through the years. Small, neat, black ink, one person writing from beginning to end. Josie began turning the pages more slowly when she noticed something. Every few dozen pages, a name had been crossed out, not with a careless stroke, but with a straight line drawn by a ruler, and beside it was a date and 3 words: employment ended, followed by the head steward's initials. She took a blank sheet of paper and began copying them down. She went back 20 years. By the time she reached the last page, she could still read clearly. Her sheet held 11 names, 11 women. She didn't know any of them. 4 sounded like names from the region. 2 were Portuguese, 1 was Polish, and the rest she couldn't place. She sat looking at the list for a long time, and then she did what she had done throughout 10 years of working for other people. The kind of thing no one ever imagined a woman who scrubbed floors would do. She compared the dates. For each name, she went back through the ledger to find the first week that woman appeared, then counted the weeks until the date the name was crossed out. The first woman, 18. The second, 18. The third, 18. She stopped, convinced she had counted wrong, and counted again from the beginning, marking each page with the tip of her finger. Still 18. She continued with the 4th, the 5th, the 6th. By the 9th, her hand had begun to tremble, and she had to put down the pen for a while. All 11 women, without a single exception, had left Hallow Point Manor during the 18th week after they began. Not the 17th week, not the 19th. 18. Every time. For 6 years, as precise as a clock. Josie pulled the desk calendar closer. She placed her finger on the first day of October, the day she had signed the contract, and counted forward. She counted twice because she didn't believe the first result. She was in her 17th week, 5 days remained, and at that moment, sitting alone in the room that had been stripped clean, Josie understood the smile at the front door the night before. Everett Crane hadn't smiled because he had accepted defeat. He had smiled because, to him, everything was still on schedule. He already had the 3 documents in his suitcase, and her 18th week would still arrive whether he continued sleeping in that house or not. Then she understood the second thing, the thing that sent a colder chill down her spine than the first. She remembered the woman standing at the sink with both hands submerged in soapy water, the woman who had spoken one warning and then fallen silent, refusing to say another word, even after Josie asked twice. Josie lowered her eyes to the 11 names on the paper before her. She read them again from top to bottom, slowly, and stopped at the 3rd line. She had seen that surname every day for 4 months, printed on the employee badge hanging beside the kitchen door. Vega. Josie carried the sheet with the 11 names down to the kitchen, intending to ask. She had rehearsed the question all the way down 2 flights of stairs, but when she walked in, Marisol Vega was setting a pot on the stove with her back turned, and 3 other servants were eating breakfast at the long table. Josie stood in the doorway for about 5 seconds, then folded the paper and slipped it into her apron pocket. Some questions couldn't be asked when there was a 3rd person in the room. She went out to the rear courtyard. Walt Osgood was standing beside the black car at the East Drive with his hands in his coat pockets, waiting for her as though he had been there for a long time. He was 63 years old, had driven for the Santoro family since Rafe's father's time, and during the past 4 months, he had spoken exactly 4 sentences to Josie, 1 sentence at a time. That morning, he held out a pale yellow envelope, unsealed and without a name on it. He said the young master had told him to give it to her, and that she was to read it before going upstairs to see him. Josie took it. She opened it right there in the rear courtyard, while the sea wind blew against her and made the edge of the paper slap her hand. The first page was a confirmation printed on hospital letterhead. Patient's name, Nell Barrow. Attending physician, Ellery. Appointment date, March 14th. Beneath that was a sentence stating that the appointment had been reserved and no further confirmation was required. Josie read it 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time, more slowly, because she was searching for some trap hidden between the lines that she hadn't yet noticed. She found none. The appointment had been reserved. That was all. For one very brief moment, she felt so light that she had to grip the side of the car. Then, the moment passed, and something else took its place. Something cold and slow rising from the base of her spine. Standing in the courtyard, Josie began to understand something she had never allowed herself to face directly during the past 3 years. The problem had never been money. She had always managed to find the money somehow. She had worked 3 jobs at once, sold the car, borrowed from Mrs. Ruth twice, and repaid her in full both times. If money had been all she needed, she would have found a way. What she could never buy, never borrow, and never trade for any number of overtime hours was an empty place in the schedule of the finest doctor in the state. That waiting list, stretching into September, wasn't a barrier made of money. It was a barrier made of order, and people stood in that line by waiting for their proper turn, just like every other mother. Rafael Santoro hadn't given her a single dollar. He hadn't paid a bill for her, erased a debt, or signed a check. He had merely picked up the telephone once, and the line had moved aside. Josie stood in the wind, holding the paper, and realized that if he could do that with one telephone call, then somewhere in the state, someone had just been pushed farther back without ever knowing why. She didn't dare follow the thought any further. But it was already there, and it made the man upstairs far more frightening than he would have been if he were merely generous. Generosity was something she understood. Generosity had limits. This didn't. The second document in the envelope was an employment contract. Josie read the heading, then had to read it again because she thought she had misunderstood. Position: head steward of Hallow Point Manor. Beneath it were clauses outlining authority, the management of 14 employees, the monthly operating budget, and the power to hire and dismiss staff. The salary was 4 times what she was earning now. And on the second page, Clause 9, the clause she had studied for so long on an afternoon in early October, had been crossed out in ink and replaced with a handwritten line. Employees may choose either residential employment or daily commuting. Days off to be arranged by individual agreement. At the bottom, in the space reserved for the employer, there was already a signature. The handwriting was slender, neat, and without flourish. Rafael Santoro. Josie looked at that signature for a long time. Walt remained beside the car without urging her to hurry. Finally, she asked him one question, the only question she asked that morning, whether the young master had said anything else. Walt considered it for a moment, as though deciding whether he should answer, then said that he had told her to read Clause 9 carefully. Josie folded the 2 documents, returned them to the envelope, and held it with both hands. The paper bearing the 11 names was still in her apron pocket. On one side was the thing she needed more than anything else in the world. On the other was the thing she had just unearthed from a leather-bound ledger no one was ever supposed to open, and she understood that when she went upstairs, she would have to decide which one to carry with her, because she couldn't place both on the same desk and still keep her footing. She entered through the kitchen door. Marisol still had her back turned at the stove, and Josie walked past her without stopping. Josie didn't go up to the second floor that day. She placed the envelope inside her personal locker, locked it, and used one of her 2 days off for the month. No one asked where she was going, because there was no longer anyone in that house with enough authority to ask. On Saturday morning, she took the earliest bus to Providence, changed routes once, and reached Mrs. Ruth Gentry's building shortly before 10 o'clock. The sun was out that day, the rare kind of coastal winter sunlight that wasn't warm enough to soften the cold, but was bright enough to make people want to sit outdoors. She saw the 2 of them from the beginning of the walkway. Mrs. Ruth was sitting in a wooden chair on the porch with a ball of yarn resting in her lap, her 2 knitting needles moving in a steady rhythm. Nell sat flat on the porch floor with her legs stretched straight out, surrounded by a circle of crayons scattered without any order at all, bending over a large sheet of paper with the kind of concentration only a child could possess. Josie stopped at the beginning of the walkway and watched for nearly half a minute before moving closer. Nell heard her footsteps before Mrs. Ruth did. The little girl looked up and cried out with delight, then immediately lowered her head toward the paper again and raised one hand to signal that her mother had to stay exactly where she was, saying she wasn't allowed to look yet because one part was still missing. Josie truly stood still. She remained there with the cloth bag in her hand and waited. Mrs. Ruth smiled and said the child had been working on it since Thursday morning and that she had needed to buy another box of crayons because yellow had run out first. About a minute later, Nell announced that she was finished and lifted the paper with both hands, holding it high above her head so that it covered her face. It was a house. A yellow house with a red roof, a tree on the left, and 3 windows. Nell lowered the paper and immediately began explaining without waiting for anyone to ask. The first window belonged to her mother, the second belonged to her, and the third belonged to Mrs. Ruth, because Mrs. Ruth had to have a window of her own. Mrs. Ruth stopped knitting. Josie sat down on the porch step until she was level with her daughter, and said the picture was beautiful, that the tree had been drawn very well, and that she liked the middle window best of all. Nell asked why. Josie said because it was the largest. The little girl nodded as though that were a perfectly reasonable answer, then began telling her how Mrs. Ruth had taught her to knit that week, but she had only managed a small section before the whole thing became tangled. And Mrs. Ruth had said it didn't matter, because it had taken her 2 winters to finish her first scarf. Josie sat and listened. She listened as the child talked about the color yellow, about the neighbor's cat that often came to lie in the sun on their porch, and about how she had tied her own shoelaces without anyone helping her, 3 times in a row, without either shoe coming loose. Sunlight fell at an angle across the porch floor. Mrs. Ruth's knitting needles began moving again. Then, in the middle of a story about the cat, Nell stopped. She looked at her mother with her head tilted slightly to one side and said very calmly, in the same voice she had just used to talk about her shoelaces, that today Mommy had smiled before she did. Josie couldn't answer at once. Nell didn't say anything more. She had already turned back to the box of crayons and was choosing a blue one to add the sky. And to her, what she had just said was merely another observation, like all the others, no more important than the cat or the shoelaces. But Josie sat motionless on the porch step and understood something she had never allowed herself to consider during the past 3 years. All that time, she had believed she was hiding it. She had believed that if she wiped her face before walking through the door, if she spoke in a normal voice, if she always brought a cheerful story to tell, then this child wouldn't know anything. She had believed it so completely that the belief had become the only thing still allowing her to feel that she was doing one decent thing. And now, on a bright morning, her 6-year-old daughter had just told her that she had been sitting on the other side and watching her all that time, that she had learned to read her mother so carefully that she knew who smiled first, and that she knew the order so well that the moment it changed, she noticed. Josie bent down and pretended to search for something inside the cloth bag, and beneath it, she drew in one deep breath and slowly let it out. When she raised her head again, her eyes looked normal. She asked Nell whether there would be clouds in the sky of her picture. Nell said yes. 3 clouds, 1 for each window. Mother and daughter remained together until well past noon. When it was time to leave, Josie stood at the beginning of the walkway and turned back for one last look. Mrs. Ruth was still knitting. Nell was holding the picture up to the sunlight so the colors could dry. On the bus ride back to Newport, Josie sat beside the window with the cloth bag in her lap and thought about the envelope locked inside her locker, about the 2 documents inside it, and about the 3rd sheet of paper resting in her apron pocket, with 11 names written by hand. By the time the bus crossed the bridge, she knew what she would say when she walked into the 2nd floor study. On Tuesday evening, shortly before 9 o'clock, Josie knocked on the door of the 2nd floor study. Rafael Santoro was sitting behind the desk with a stack of papers and a glass of water he hadn't touched. He told her to come in without looking up, and by the time he raised his eyes, she was already standing in the middle of the room. She placed the pale yellow envelope on the desk, not pushing it toward him, simply setting it down, and spoke the sentence she had rehearsed for 2 days on the bus, her voice steady and without a tremor. She said she wasn't some abandoned dog he had taken in. Rafe showed no reaction. He set down his pen, leaned back in his chair, and waited. Josie continued. She said she had read both documents in the envelope, that she knew a place in Dr. Ellery's schedule wasn't something money could buy, and that was exactly why she was standing there at 9 o'clock at night instead of having signed the day before. She said she would accept the position, and then she gave him her 3 conditions. First, she would repay every cent of that appointment, 1 amount each month. She didn't care what its monetary value was, but he had to convert it into a number, and every time she made a payment, he had to sign a receipt. Second, he wasn't allowed to involve her in any part of his business. She would handle the operation of the house, while the cars carrying license plates from other states would remain things she didn't see, didn't hear, and wasn't permitted to ask about. Third, her daughter would never set foot inside that house, not once, not for any reason. When she finished, she stood there with her hands at her sides, ready for the hardest part. The part she had practiced most carefully. The part where he would ask why, and she would have to explain. Rafe said, "All right." Josie blinked. He said it again. "All 3. All right." Then he pulled a sheet of paper from the stack, wrote 4 lines on it, signed his name, and pushed it toward her. She bent down to read. Her 3 conditions had been copied exactly as she had spoken them, in her own words, with a number added to the first line, and a sentence stating that a receipt would be issued on the final day of each month. Josie stared at the page and realized something deeply unsettling. She had prepared herself for a fight, and the other side hadn't come to the battlefield. She had brought everything she possessed, and everything she possessed had become useless in 4 seconds. She asked why he had agreed so easily. Rafe said because all 3 conditions were right. Then he stood, walked around the desk, and stopped about 3 paces away from her, coming no closer, exactly as he had that night in the kitchen. He said now it was his turn. He also had 3 things to say, and she didn't need to agree. She only needed to listen. First, he said he didn't buy people. He said he paid people who could do the work, and during the past 4 months, the only person in that house who had kept it moving in the proper rhythm without needing to be reminded was her, while the man earning the highest salary had been busy sitting behind a desk taking notes. He said that if she believed the contract was an act of pity, then she was underestimating both him and herself. Second, he spoke more slowly, and his voice dropped 1 degree lower. He said that within 4 miles of that house, no one was allowed to touch her. He said it wasn't a promise made to her, because a promise could be withdrawn if someone asked. It was his law, and no one could ask for his law to be withdrawn. Josie looked at him as he said it, and understood, truly understood for the first time, that on the night at the staircase, the reason that hand had left her waist hadn't been because of her. It had been because of a law that existed before she ever entered the house. It didn't make her feel safer. It made her feel smaller. Then he gave her the 3rd condition. He told her to stop pretending she wasn't tired. Josie stood motionless. In the 4 months she had lived at the manor, and in the 3 years before that, no one had ever said those words to her. People asked whether she was all right, and she said she was, and they believed her because believing her was convenient for everyone. She opened her mouth to say she truly was all right, then realized she was about to do the very thing he had just named, and she closed it again. She stood there, and for one very brief moment, she felt her throat tighten. She didn't cry. She only lowered her eyes, picked up the pen from the desk, and signed both documents, the contract and the page recording the 3 conditions, then set the pen down. Before leaving the room, she stopped at the door and looked back. The sheet bearing the 11 names was still in her apron pocket. She had intended to give it to him that night, but she had just heard him say that he paid people who could do the work, and she thought of the name on the 3rd line of that list, the surname she still saw every day on the badge hanging beside the kitchen door, and she understood that if she handed over the paper now, she would be placing the fate of 11 women in the hands of a man she didn't yet know well enough. She left the paper in her pocket. She wished him good night and walked out. On Wednesday morning, Walt Osgood handed Josie a small wooden box containing the keys and a typed transfer inventory with 41 entries, each on its own line, with a box at the end for her signature. He waited while she read it, and after she finished signing, he added 1 more sentence. There was a rule in that house that appeared on no inventory, a rule dating back to the young master's father. No one except the head steward was permitted to enter the 2nd floor study, not the cleaning staff, not repairmen, not even guests. Josie asked who had cleaned the room during the past 22 years. Walt said Mr. Crane had. Then he left, leaving her standing with the wooden box in her hands and a thought she would carry for many weeks afterward, that the man had spent 22 years alone inside a room no one else was allowed to enter. That afternoon, Josie performed her first duty in her new position. She took down the weekly assignment board, rewrote the entire schedule, and posted the new one. On the new schedule, there was no column called additional duty. She stood, looking at the 14 names arranged in 14 rows, and realized that although she knew every face, she knew only 7 of their names. She began learning the remaining 7 that same afternoon. Late that evening, after most of the kitchen staff had gone, Josie went downstairs. Marisol Vega stood at the sink, with both hands submerged in soapy water, scrubbing the large cast-iron pot she had scrubbed at that hour for 20 years. Josie took the sheet of paper from her apron pocket, unfolded it on the cutting table, smoothed it flat, and stepped back. Marisol didn't turn around. Josie said she had found the ledger. She said there were 11 names in it, that she had counted the weeks for each woman, and that all 11 had left the house during their 18th week. Then she asked the question she had carried inside her since that morning. Why Marisol had spoken only 1 sentence to her and then fallen silent. Why she hadn't spoken a 2nd sentence when Josie asked her a 2nd time. Marisol turned off the faucet. She stood motionless for several seconds with her hands still wet, then dried them on her apron and turned around. She looked at the sheet on the cutting table. She didn't need to read it. She only looked at it. Then she said it was because she was the 3rd woman in that ledger, Miss Barrow, and she was still standing there. Josie said nothing. She listened as the words fell into place and automatically filled every empty space she had carried with her for weeks. The 3rd woman, her name crossed out with a straight line, her final day of employment clearly recorded, the head steward's initials beside it. Yet 20 years later, That woman was still standing at the same sink at 10 o'clock at night. Josie understood that some names had been crossed out not because those people had left, but because they had agreed to something in order to remain, and the price of remaining was 20 years of silence, even when someone new walked through the door and began following the same path they had once followed. She asked Marisol one final question, where the other 10 women were now. Marisol said she didn't know, and she was telling the truth. There was nothing left in her voice to conceal. She said that once people left, no one ever called them again. Then she turned the faucet back on and returned to the pot. Josie folded the paper, placed it in her pocket, and went upstairs. The following Tuesday, there was a meeting on the second floor. Bruno Falcone arrived at 7 o'clock with 2 other men, whom Josie wasn't introduced to and didn't ask about. He was 45 years old, wore an expensive coat, and while speaking to her at the top of the stairs, he glanced down at his wristwatch twice, the habit of a man who wanted the other person to know that any time spent on them was time being wasted. He asked how long she had worked there. Josie said 4 months. He nodded thoughtfully, then said that the house had once employed a steward who knew what he was doing, and that replacing someone in the middle of the season wasn't a wise way to run things. Josie said she would do her best. Bruno laughed, but he didn't look at her when he did. He looked past her shoulder toward the study door and said, loudly enough for the person behind it to hear, that people were beginning to say the boss was growing soft. The study door opened. Rafael Santoro stood there with a file still in one hand. He didn't respond to what had just been said. He only looked at Bruno Falcone and told him to come in, that he was 10 minutes late. Bruno entered. The other 2 men followed. The door closed, and Josie remained alone at the top of the staircase, holding the ring of keys whose weight she still hadn't grown accustomed to. Marisol had said that once people left, no one ever called them again, and Josie thought about those words for 2 weeks before deciding that she would be the one to call. It took her 4 evenings to find the numbers. She had no access to any system. All she had were 11 handwritten names and an old telephone, so she worked the way people worked when they had nothing in their hands. She searched public directories, searched free people finder sites, compared ages and locations, and slowly eliminated the wrong results. By the end of the week, she had 7 numbers she felt certain about and 4 that were only guesses. She began calling during the hours when a working woman might be home, between 7 and 9 o'clock in the evening. 7 people didn't answer. She called a second time the following night, a third time over the weekend, and those 7 numbers still rang until the calls ended. Either without voicemail or with voicemail messages no one returned. 3 women answered. The first, after hearing Josie say the words Hallow Point, remained silent for about 3 seconds and hung up without saying anything. The second asked where Josie had gotten the number, her voice rising sharply, then hung up. The third listened until Josie finished one sentence, then said, "Don't call here again, dear. I have young children," and hung up as well. Josie sat on the bed in her staff room after the third call, the telephone still warm in her hand, and understood that those 3 disconnected calls had told her more than anything a person willing to answer might have said. The 4th woman answered on Thursday evening. Her name was Dorothy Whelan. She was 60 years old, lived in Pawtucket, and she didn't hang up. She asked where Josie was calling from. Josie told her the truth, and Dorothy was silent for a very long time, before asking whether she was the new one. Josie said she was. Dorothy said she had been waiting for that call for 6 years, but she hadn't expected it to come from inside that house. She said she had worked at Hallow Point for 4 months during the spring of that year, then left, and she didn't want to discuss the reason over the telephone. Josie didn't press her. She asked a different question, the same one she asked everyone, what Dorothy had done before working at the manor. Dorothy said she had been a personnel secretary for a construction company for 19 years, until the company was absorbed by a larger corporation and her entire department was eliminated. She gave the corporation's name. Josie sat upright. She asked her to repeat it to be certain. Dorothy said it again. Santoro. She explained that this was why she had been able to get a job at Hallow Point, because people said the owners gave hiring preference to former employees of their subsidiary companies. Josie could hear the heater running in her room, hear it with unnatural clarity, and she asked the next question before she had time to think. She asked whether Dorothy had handled workplace accident files. Dorothy said she handled everything because she was the only person in the department who could type quickly. Josie was silent for several seconds. Then she spoke the name, Aaron Barrow. There was a silence on the other end so long that Josie thought the connection had been lost. Then Dorothy Whelan asked what relation she was to him. Josie said she was his wife. Dorothy whispered, "Oh my God," so softly, and said nothing more for nearly half a minute. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. She said she remembered that name, remembered it clearly, because she had typed every document from that day and throughout the weeks that followed. She remembered it because it was the only file in her 19 years of work where the findings of the internal investigation didn't match the findings sent to the insurance company. Josie had risen from the bed without realizing it. She asked what Dorothy meant by didn't match. Dorothy said the report sent to the insurer placed the blame on the worker and cited failure to follow proper safety procedures. But the internal report, the one Dorothy had typed 4 days earlier, concluded that the equipment hadn't met inspection standards and that responsibility belonged to the company managing the construction site. She said she remembered it exactly because she had asked her supervisor whether she had typed something incorrectly, and she had been told to type the document exactly as it appeared in the draft given to her. Then she told Josie the final part. She said compensation for the Barrow family had been approved from the company's liability fund, not through the insurance policy, and she had typed both the payment request and the approval form. $190,000. She said she remembered the amount because it was the largest figure she had ever typed in her life. She asked what Josie had done with the money. Josie stood in the middle of the small room with the telephone pressed to her ear and heard herself say that she had never received a single dollar. This time, the silence on the other end lasted even longer than before. Dorothy Whelan said that couldn't be possible, that she had seen the approving signature with her own eyes. Josie asked who had signed it. Dorothy said she couldn't remember. It had been 3 years, and she had only glanced at signatures coming down from the upper floor. But she remembered one detail. She said the approval form that day had carried 2 signatures instead of 1, even though the procedure required only 1. Josie asked several more questions after that, but Dorothy didn't know anything else. Before ending the call, Dorothy told her one thing. "Don't ask anyone inside that house, dear." Josie sat in the second-floor study from 11 o'clock at night until 3 o'clock in the morning. She didn't turn on the ceiling light. She used only the desk lamp. In front of her lay the paper bearing the 11 names, and beside it was a blank sheet on which she had written exactly 3 lines. 190,000, approved 3 years ago, never reached her. And at the bottom, she wrote one question, then sat staring at it for a very long time inside the circle of light cast by the desk lamp. A question made of only 3 words. Who stopped it? Josie found nothing else during the 2 weeks that followed. She called Dorothy Whelan twice more, and both times the woman repeated exactly what she had already told her, and couldn't remember any further details. The remaining 7 names still didn't answer. Josie entered a state of waiting, and while she waited, she did her work, because that was the only thing she knew how to do when there were no doors left to knock on. And it was that work, the occupation no one had treated as a real occupation during the past 10 years, that found the answer before she did. The first thing was the rug. In the second-floor study, a medium-sized wool rug with a dark border lay beneath the desk. Since taking possession of the keys, Josie had been the only person permitted to enter the room, and she cleaned it every morning at 6 o'clock. The wooden floor beneath the rug was darker than the exposed boards, because 70 years of sunlight through the window had faded the uncovered wood, leaving a very thin line around the rug's edges, the kind of line only someone who knelt to clean the floor every day would notice. On the first Wednesday morning, Josie saw that the western edge of the rug had shifted away from that line by about the width of 1 finger joint. She pulled it back without giving it any thought. 6 days later, it had shifted again, on the same side, by the same amount. The third time, she stood still for nearly half a minute before bending down. She opened the calendar inside her mind, and all 3 times had been the morning after Bruno Falcone came for an evening meeting. She didn't pull the rug back into place that day. She left it as it was, and wrote the date on the back of the paper bearing the 11 names. The second thing was the wine cellar. Hallow Point's wine cellar lay beneath the east wing, built in 1953, with stone walls and a low ceiling, and it appeared on the monthly cleaning schedule. Josie had cleaned it once in November, when she was still a servant, and she cleaned it a second time, at the end of February, now as the person in charge. She remembered the procedure clearly, because she had done it with her own hands. The 3 wine crates on the lowest row against the north wall had to be raised with a wooden lever, so the floor beneath them could be vacuumed. In November, she had done it alone in about 40 minutes. It hadn't been easy, but it had been possible. At the end of February, She placed the lever in the same position, pressed down with all her weight, and the crate didn't move. She changed her stance and tried again. Still nothing. She tried the second crate, then the third, and all three were the same. Josie sat on the stone step in the cellar, caught her breath, and began thinking the way she always thought when something refused to work as it should. The same wooden crate, the same lever, the same woman, and that woman had eaten and slept better during the past 3 months, not grown weaker. Therefore, the only thing that could have changed was what lay inside. She walked along the lowest row and counted 11 crates. She tested the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th, and each one lifted exactly as she remembered. Only the 3 crates against the north wall wouldn't move. She shone a flashlight into the narrow gap between the lid and the side of one crate. The lid had been fastened with new nails, their heads still bright, while all the other crates used old nails that had gone dull. Josie switched off the flashlight. She sat in the wine cellar for nearly 10 minutes, and during those 10 minutes, she understood that she was standing before something the second condition in the agreement she had signed with Rafael Santoro forbade her from seeing. She had written that condition herself. She had read it aloud in the second-floor study. She wouldn't see the cars carrying license plates from other states, wouldn't hear them, and wouldn't be permitted to ask about them. She stood, gathered her cleaning supplies, locked the cellar door, and went upstairs. That evening, she took out the transfer inventory and read it again. 41 entries, 1 on each line, every one bearing her signature at the end. She read from the beginning, slowly, comparing every line with the wooden key box placed in front of her. At the 29th entry, she stopped. Wine cellar lock, mechanical, 2 copies. Josie opened the wooden box. She emptied all the keys onto the desk and arranged them in a row. She counted twice. There was exactly 1 wine cellar key, the long brass key with the round head that she had used that afternoon. There was no second one. She checked the inventory again for any note about a spare copy. There was none. She searched the lower compartment of the wooden box, and even checked the envelope Walt had provided with it on the day of the transfer. Nothing. Then she looked down at her own signature at the end of the 29th line, the signature she had written on a busy morning 7 weeks earlier, and realized something that sent a chill through her entire body. She had signed for 2 copies of the key. She had never held the second one in her hand. According to the records of that house, the person responsible for the mechanical lock beneath the cellar was her, and her alone. Josie sat before the inventory for a very long time, and she didn't go to Walt, didn't go to Rafe, and didn't ask anyone anything. She folded the paper, placed it in the locker with the sheet bearing the 11 names and the white page with the 3-word question written on its final line, then locked the door. Josie intended to remain silent for 1 more week. Then, on Friday morning, while wiping the desk in the second-floor study, she remembered a detail Dorothy Whelan had mentioned, and she had overlooked, that the approval form that day had carried 2 signatures instead of 1. She straightened with the cloth still in her hand and understood that if there had been 2 signatures, then someone on the upper floor had seen that file, and there weren't many people on the upper floor of a subsidiary belonging to the Santoro Corporation. That evening, she went upstairs and knocked on the door. She brought no papers with her. She simply stood in the middle of the room and asked him one question, whether he knew the name Aaron Barrow. Rafael Santoro set down his pen. He didn't ask where she had heard it, didn't ask whom she had spoken to, and didn't show even half a second of surprise. He said yes. Josie stood there and waited for what came next, the part she expected to be a long explanation, but he didn't explain. He continued in the same even voice he used when reading a line from a contract, saying that he had known who she was before she submitted her application, that he hadn't hired her, he had found her. The silence in the room lasted long enough for Josie to hear the heating system running beneath the floor. She asked him to say it again. He repeated it word for word without adding anything. Then he told her the rest, briefly, leaving her nowhere to take hold and argue. 2 years earlier, when he ordered a review of every workplace accident file from the subsidiary companies over the previous 7 years, there had been 26 cases, and among those 26 was one in which the internal findings didn't match the report submitted to the insurance company. He read the dead man's name. He had someone locate the family. He said the payment had been approved a year earlier, and he hadn't understood why it had never reached them, so he ordered it sent again through the corporation's law office. Josie felt her hands turn cold. She remembered that check. It had arrived on an April afternoon inside an envelope, bearing the letterhead of a law firm she had never heard of, with a number printed on it so large that it seemed absurd, and at that time she was in the 9th month since losing her home, receiving calls every day from 3 unfamiliar telephone numbers demanding payment, while 3 other people offered her money that didn't exist. She had torn it up on the stairway landing without reading it all, and she had believed herself wise for refusing to fall into the trap. 7 months later, a second envelope had arrived. She had torn that one up too, even faster than the first. Rafe said that after the second attempt, his attorney told him there was no lawful way left to give money to someone who refused to accept it. He said he could have found her home, stood at her door, and placed it directly into her hands. Then he paused and spoke the next sentence more slowly, saying that he knew exactly what would be created in that neighborhood if a man carrying the Santoro name knocked on the door of a widow in West Providence, and he hadn't wanted to leave that behind for her. So he chose the last method still available. He opened a position at Hallow Point, arranged for the job notice to reach the exact area where she was searching for work, and waited. Josie asked whether anyone had even read her application. Rafe said no. She stood motionless for a very long time. During the past 4 months, whenever she thought about that house, she had believed it was a place she had found for herself, the only thing in 3 years she had earned through her own effort. She had held on to that belief the way a person held on to a banister, and now it was gone. She hadn't been hired. She had been placed there. Then another thought came, and it was that thought that made her put one hand on the edge of the desk. She spoke it aloud in a very quiet voice. She said that meant the night on the 3rd-floor staircase, and the 4 months of night shifts before it, and the 3 documents in the drawer, and the ledger containing 11 names in which she had nearly become the 12th. All of those things had happened because he had brought her into that house. Rafe didn't answer. Josie continued, and her voice began to tremble, not from fear. She said he had sat on the 2nd floor for 4 months with a carefully reviewed list of 26 workplace accidents, and hadn't known that inside his own house there was a leather-bound ledger, counting women by the week. She said he could see across the entire state of Rhode Island, but couldn't see what was lying beneath his own feet. Rafe stood. He didn't argue with a single word. He said she was right. He said it was his fault, and he wasn't going to apologize because an apology couldn't change anything that had already happened. Josie said she didn't need an apology. She said she needed to know only one thing: whether the appointment on March 14th, the appointment that had made her feel weightless as she stood in the windy courtyard, was something he had given her, or something he was repaying her. Rafe said it was something she should have received 3 years earlier. Josie nodded. She said that meant it was a debt, not kindness, and for 4 months she had stood inside that house feeling grateful to a man who was merely repaying what he owed her. She reached into her apron pocket, took out the ring of keys, and placed it on the desk beside his pen. The sound of metal touching wood was clean and sharp. She said she would still take Nell to her appointment on March 14th because the child had nothing to do with any of this. Then she said she was returning everything else. She turned and walked out. Rafe didn't call her back. Josie went down 2 flights of stairs, collected her bag from the staff room, and walked out of Hallow Point Manor at 10:40 at night, carrying nothing except what she had brought with her. The black car was already waiting at the East Drive when Josie stepped down from the final stone step, and Walt Osgood stood beside the open rear door as though he had known an hour in advance. Josie meant to tell him she would walk to the bus station. Then she looked at the time, saw that it was nearly 11 o'clock at night, and got into the car. They had traveled about 3 miles when Walt spoke. He didn't turn around. His eyes remained on the road, and he said he was going to tell her one story, and once he finished, that would be the end of it, and she could think whatever she chose. He said the young master's mother had been named Inez. She had worked as a maid for a family in Bristol for 19 years, washing floors and doing laundry, beginning when she was 22. He said that during all 19 of those years, not one person in that house had called her by her name. They called her girl, then later the maid, and when she was past 40, they called her that woman. Walt said he had been the one who drove her from Bristol back to Providence on her final day, that she died 6 months later, and that on the condolence card the family sent, they had misspelled her last name. He said the young master had been 19 then. Then he spoke the final sentence, that the young master never told that story to anyone, and Miss Barrow, she mustn't ask him about it. Walt fell silent. The car continued along the coastal road as the streetlights grew farther apart. Josie looked through the window and allowed the story to remain where it was. She didn't feel herself soften. She carried the weight of someone much older than her, 27 years, and she knew that a sad story about a man's mother didn't erase the fact that he had placed her inside that house without her knowledge. The two things didn't cancel each other out. They simply lay beside one another. But something else began stirring in her mind, and it had nothing to do with Inés Santoro. It had to do with the fact that she was riding away from a place whose ledger she hadn't yet closed. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the employee key card. She had returned the ring of keys. She had placed it on the desk beside the pen, and she had heard the clean sound of metal touching wood. But she had forgotten the key card because it had been in her coat pocket instead of her apron pocket, and now it was here in her hand, 7 miles from Hollow Point Manor. She sat upright, and immediately after that thought came another. The thought she had locked inside the cabinet with the 3 papers and had tried not to open for 2 weeks. The transfer inventory contained 41 entries. The 29th line read wine cellar, lock, mechanical, 2 copies. She had only ever held one. She had signed for both, which meant that according to the records of that house, the person responsible for that lock was Josephine Barrow. And tomorrow morning, when she was no longer there, no one in the world would know that a second key existed beyond anyone's control. She thought about the 3 wine crates that couldn't be lifted. She thought about the new nails whose heads were still bright. She thought about the rug that had shifted 3 times in 2 weeks, always on the morning after the man who kept glancing at his watch came for a meeting. Josie told Walt to turn the car around. Walt didn't ask why. He only looked at her through the rearview mirror for about 1 second, then slowed down, turned into a narrow side road, and reversed direction. They reached the east gate shortly before midnight. Walt switched off the headlights while they were still on the road and parked about 30 yards from the gate. With the instinct of a man who had driven for that family for 40 years, Hollow Point Manor was dark. The second-floor windows were dark. The study was dark. The servants' wing was dark. The entire third-floor corridor was dark. There was only 1 light left in the whole building, and it wasn't in any place where light should have been burning at that hour. In the east wing, close to the ground, a thin line of pale yellow light spilled from beneath the wooden door, leading down to the wine cellar. Josie sat motionless in the car, staring at that narrow strip of light. She was the one who had locked that door that afternoon. She remembered clearly because she had turned the key twice with her own hand and pulled the handle once to test it, exactly as she did with all 41 entries on her inventory. Walt was looking toward it too. He said nothing. Then he reached inside his coat, and Josie heard him draw in 1 long, slow breath. The breath of a 63-year-old man who had just realized that this night wouldn't be like the others. He told her to remain in the car. Josie opened the door and stepped out. Josie entered through the Eastern Service entrance, using the employee key card she should have returned, and moved through the darkness with the memory of someone who had cleaned every foot of flooring in that house for 4 months. Walt followed behind her, unable to stop her in time. When she reached the beginning of the corridor leading down to the cellar, she stopped and stared at the wooden door with the thin line of pale yellow light spilling beneath it. The wine cellar lock wasn't connected to the keycard system. It was a mechanical lock installed the same year the cellar was built, 1953. The kind of lock that required the entire cylinder to be removed before another key could be made. There were only 2 copies in the entire house. One was inside the wooden box Josie had returned with the ring of keys 2 hours earlier. The other had never been handed over to her, and now, standing 6 paces from that door, she understood that it had never been handed over to anyone else either. It simply had never left the coat pocket of the man who had kept it for 22 years. Josie pulled Walt back into the shadows and whispered that he needed to call the young master. Call him now, and tell him to come down to the wine cellar. Walt asked whether she was certain. She said she was. He took out his telephone, dialed a number, and spoke exactly 7 words into it. Then the 2 of them stood there. Voices drifted up from the cellar. The words indistinct, 2 men speaking. One voice deep and hurried, the other low and even. Josie recognized the second voice before she had time to prepare herself for recognizing it, and both her hands turned cold. She had heard that voice every day for 4 months, the courteous voice that never changed, the one used for every person, every circumstance, and every hour of the day. Everett Crane had left that house with a suitcase near midnight, almost 3 months earlier. He had been dismissed from his residence, his position, and the payroll. No one had taken the second key from him because, according to the records, that key had already been transferred to the new head steward, and the new head steward had signed for all 41 entries on a busy morning. He had been expelled from the house, but he had never lost the ability to enter it. Rafael Santoro arrived 9 minutes later. He came down the corridor without making a sound, and when he stood beside her, Josie gave him the facts in the same concise voice she used when reporting on the operation of the manor. She told him about the 3 crates on the lowest row against the north wall. She said she had been able to raise them in November, but couldn't at the end of February, using the same lever and the same strength. She said the nails in the lids were new. She said the rug beneath the second-floor desk had shifted 3 times in 2 weeks, and every time had been the morning after Bruno Falcone came for an evening meeting. Then she gave him the final detail, that the transfer inventory listed 2 wine cellar keys, and she had only ever held one. Rafe listened to everything without interrupting once. Then he walked to the door and opened it. The wine cellar was fully lit. Bruno Falcone stood in the center aisle between the 2 rows of racks with his sleeves rolled up, and in front of him was a wooden crate whose lid had been pried open. Everett Crane stood behind him near the second step from the bottom, holding a stack of documents. In that moment, Josie saw the entire structure she had spent 2 weeks assembling from scattered pieces. Bruno was the one who signed. He had the position, the authority to approve shipping documents, and an officially recognized signature, and his was the only name that would appear if anyone followed the paper trail. But Bruno Falcone didn't know the schedules of the 14 servants. He didn't know what time the kitchen closed on any given night. He didn't know how far the cameras at the corner of the East Wing could see, and where their blind spots began. The man who knew all of that was the one who had lived in the house for 22 years, and had personally written every shift in small, neat handwriting inside a leather-bound ledger. Rafe descended 3 steps and asked what was inside the crate. Bruno began speaking very quickly, saying it was only temporary consigned cargo, that it would be moved within a few nights, that Rafe didn't need to know the details. Rafe didn't let him finish. He walked forward, looked inside the opened crate, then straightened, and Josie saw his face change. It wasn't anger. It was something colder than anger. He told Bruno that he had allowed other people to use property bearing Rafe's name as a transfer point, and that if those 3 crates were discovered beneath his house, the person standing before a federal court wouldn't be Bruno, wouldn't be the organization that had sent the cargo, but the man whose name appeared on the deed to the land. Bruno said no one would ever find them. Rafe said a cleaning woman had found them with a wooden lever. At that exact moment, Everett Crane turned his head. He had heard footsteps on the stairs before Josie had finished coming down. He had heard them while she was still at the beginning of the corridor, because after 22 years in that house, the thing he knew best wasn't its rooms but the footsteps of every person who moved through them. He didn't say a word to Bruno. He didn't look at Rafe. He simply tucked the stack of papers beneath his arm, turned, and moved quickly toward the rear cellar exit, the small door leading to the eastern slope that Josie knew well because once each month she had to clean the steps outside it. Walt rushed to the door, but the heavy iron latch clicked, locked from the outside. Realizing Crane had escaped into the dark, Walt immediately turned back into the cellar, and in the brightly lit wine cellar, Bruno Falcone was left standing alone beside the crate, with its lid torn open, between the 2 rows of racks, wearing the expression of a man who had just realized that the person who had drawn him into this had disappeared and had never intended to come back for him. Bruno Falcone looked at the small door that had just slammed shut, then at Rafael Santoro, then at the stairs behind Rafe, and Josie saw the exact moment he made his calculation. He didn't need to escape the cellar. He needed to escape the grounds, and Hollow Point had 4 barriers: the east gate, the west gate, the sea fence, and the guard post on the main road, all of them controlled by Rafe's men. There was no way to cross all 4 on foot. There was only one way, and Bruno Falcone turned his head to find it. He didn't have to search for long. There were 4 people in that brightly lit cellar, and 3 of them weren't people Rafe would stop for. Josie was standing on the 3rd step from the bottom, about 4 paces away from him. He moved remarkably fast for a man of 45. Josie managed to step back half a pace before his arm swept across her chest and pulled her backward, turning her to face Rafe and holding her between the 2 men as though she were a shield. He began speaking, his voice breaking on the first few words, saying, "You let me out through the east gate, and once I'm gone, she comes down. You know I'm not joking, Rafe." Josie looked directly into Rafael Santoro's face and saw him stop. He didn't retreat. He simply stopped. And during those 2 seconds, all the power that frightened the entire state became useless, because there was nowhere for him to set it down. She understood at once that if she stood still and waited, Those 2 seconds would stretch into 10 minutes, then into a car ride toward the gate, then into something no one in that cellar could control anymore. She didn't wait. 6 weeks earlier, when she took over the household inventory, Josie had done something no one noticed, and no one thanked her for. She had reorganized the entire cleaning supply shelf in the wine cellar. The shelf had been a disorderly pile of things stacked on top of one another for 20 years, and she had spent an afternoon sorting everything, throwing away expired supplies, and arranging the rest in the order she used them. Cloths and gloves on the top shelf, brushes and tools in the middle, bottles of cleaning solution in the lower compartment on the right, and inside that compartment, the strongest industrial cleaner was always placed on the far left because she was left-handed. No one in that house knew it. No one needed to know. The shelf was directly behind her right shoulder, less than a handspan away. Josie didn't look toward it. She let her right hand hang loosely at her side, and while Bruno was still talking to Rafe about the east gate, she reached behind her, found the edge of the lowest compartment, and her fingers touched the plastic cap she had held dozens of times. She lifted the bottle, twisted the nozzle, and moved so quickly that she didn't have time to feel afraid. She sprayed it directly into his face. Bruno screamed, and both his hands flew away from her to cover his eyes. The instant his arm loosened, Josie drove all her weight down through her heel and stamped on the top of his foot. He buckled sideways. That was all Josie did. Rafe and Walt reached him within 2 seconds. Josie stumbled backward to the stairs, turned her face toward the stone wall, and stood there with both hands shaking violently, listening as the plastic bottle rolled across the cellar floor and finally stopped somewhere beneath the wine racks. When she turned around, Bruno Falcone was lying face down on the stone floor, with one cheek pressed against it, both arms held behind his back by Walt, breathing through his mouth in short, broken bursts. Rafe knelt beside him on one knee, but he didn't touch him. He asked only one question, very quietly. Why this house? And Bruno Falcone, lying on the stone floor of the cellar where he had just tried to use Josie as his way out, did what men with nowhere left to go always did. He threw out what he believed was his final weapon. He said, "You're asking me why, Rafe? Then ask her how her husband died." Josie stood frozen at the foot of the stairs. Rafe said nothing. Bruno continued, speaking rapidly, pouring the words out, saying that 3 years earlier he had been in charge of the construction division, that he had buried inspection reports and cut back on safety materials so he could take the difference, that everything had run smoothly for 2 years, until a scaffolding worker opened a filing cabinet in the site office and read something he wasn't supposed to see. He said the man's name was Barrow. He said Barrow had photographed the documents and told the site supervisor that he intended to file a complaint with the state labor department. Then he said the part Josie would carry with her for the rest of her life. He said he hadn't ordered anyone to do anything. He had simply refused to replace the scaffolding that had already failed inspection, and he allowed it to remain in use for another 11 days while waiting for the inspection period to pass. 11 days. The accident happened on the 9th. He said that afterward, he had done only one thing. He had made sure the file was never reopened, and keeping it closed had been simple. The file would only be reopened if someone came looking for the money, so the check couldn't be allowed to reach its destination. He had signed the order to stop it on the upper floor, twice. Rafe stood. He remained there for a very long time without speaking, and Josie saw something on his face she had never seen before. The expression of a man who had just realized that the thing he had spent 2 years searching for inside 26 files had been sitting across from him at a meeting every Tuesday night. He hadn't known, but he didn't say it. He didn't turn to Josie and tell her that he hadn't known. He only told Walt to call the men downstairs, then added one more instruction. Preserve the scene exactly as it is, and don't touch the 3 crates. Rafe's men came down to the cellar about 10 minutes later, and Josie went upstairs ahead of them and sat on the stone steps outside the east wing, because she didn't want to remain inside that cellar for even 1 more minute. The night was bitterly cold. She sat there until Rafael Santoro came outside and lowered himself onto the steps about an arm's length away, and when he braced one hand against the stone, Josie saw the blood. The back of his left hand had been split by a long cut, dust from the stone clinging to the wound as blood ran slowly toward the cuff of his shirt. He said it was nothing. Josie stood, went inside for the first aid kit hanging in the service corridor, the same place where she herself had mounted it 6 weeks earlier, then returned and sat beside him on the steps. She took his hand and rested it on her knee. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic, patted it dry, then wrapped it in bandages, working slowly, every turn smooth and even, the way people performed a task their hands already knew. Rafe didn't pull away. He watched her work, and he didn't say a word until she cut the bandage and secured the final end. Josie sat quietly for a moment with his hand still resting on her knee, and she remembered another hand on the third-floor staircase on a night in February, a hand she hadn't dared push away because 3 documents were locked inside a drawer. Tonight she was holding an injured hand, and she was holding it because she had chosen to. Then she lowered it, closed the first aid kit, and told him he should wash the wound again properly. On March 14th, Josie woke at 5 o'clock. At 6:30, she stood in a hospital corridor with Mrs. Ruth and Nell, every document submitted, all 3 papers replaced with valid certified copies from the Vital Records office after 4 weeks of traveling back and forth. Near noon, when everything in the appointment had been completed, and Nell was sitting in the waiting room with her box of crayons, Josie stepped into the hallway, took out her telephone, and called Rafael Santoro. She was the one who made the call. No one had asked her to. No one had suggested it. And the third condition she herself had written in the second-floor study was withdrawn by her own choice. He arrived 40 minutes later. He came alone, without guards, without an escort, driving himself. And he carried a coloring book he had bought at the bookstore across the street. Nell looked up at the unfamiliar man, then at the book, then asked who he was. Rafe sat in the plastic chair beside her, placed the coloring book on the table, and said he was a friend of her mother's, and had only come to sit with them. Nell told him to sit, then pushed the box of crayons into the middle of the table as though dividing a share, and declared that anyone who sat there had to color because that was the rule. Mrs. Ruth laughed. Josie sat across from them. Nell finished coloring 2 pages, and announced that there had to be strawberry ice cream that day because it was a special day, and Mrs. Ruth said that yes, it truly was a special day. The 4 of them remained at that plastic table in the waiting room for nearly an hour, and Rafael Santoro colored 1.5 pages, working very slowly and carefully, while Nell observed that he stayed inside the lines and was better at it than her mother. Everett Crane's story ended in paperwork and evasion. A warrant was issued for his break-in and involvement with the contraband, but he vanished from Rhode Island before the state troopers could locate him. Meanwhile, the leather-bound ledger was delivered to a law office in Providence, together with the handwritten sheet containing 11 names and the comparison of weeks Josie had prepared with her own hands on a January morning. The case was submitted to the state labor agency, and while Crane remained a fugitive, he was permanently stripped of his professional licensing and placed on a statewide blacklist. 7 of the 11 women received letters asking them to testify. 6 responded. The 4th woman on the list, Mrs. Dorothy Whelan of Pawtucket, sent the earliest reply, and her letter contained only 1 sentence, that she had been waiting for 6 years. By June, Josie had rented a small house in Middletown with 3 windows facing the street, and she brought Nell home to live with her. She continued working as head steward of Hollow Point Manor, but she commuted each day, leaving in the morning and returning home at night, exactly as the handwritten sentence replacing Clause 9 allowed. On the final day of each month, she carried a payment to the second-floor study and received a signed receipt in return. She kept every one of those receipts inside a tin box on top of her cabinet. Rafael Santoro continued accepting her money each month. He never refused it, never told her she no longer needed to pay, because he understood better than anyone that the money wasn't repayment for a debt. It was the one thing that allowed this woman to stand upright inside his house. One afternoon in June, Walt Osgood drove her home to Middletown. As the car traveled along the coastal road, he remarked almost absent-mindedly that 3 years earlier, he had often driven the construction crews working on that route, that the young workers had filled every seat in the car, and that several boys from West Providence had boarded every morning at the same street corner. Josie turned to look at him. He kept his eyes on the road. She remembered the 2 unmarked envelopes, one arriving during the 4th month after she lost her home, the other during the winter of the following year, both containing only cash and not a single written word. She had believed they came from the church. She remained silent for a long time, then asked him about it very softly. Walt said he didn't know what she was talking about. Then, a while later, as the car turned onto the narrow road, he added one more sentence, that he had a granddaughter about her age. Some people pass through this world their entire lives without anyone ever calling them by their proper names. They wash the stairs we climb, clear the tables where we sit, and we convince ourselves that their silence means they see nothing. But dignity isn't something granted from above. It has belonged to every human being from the beginning, and sometimes the kindest thing one person can do for another is simply return it. Josephine Barrow had never needed anyone to rescue her. She only needed someone willing to look at her long enough to see that she had never once been defeated. If Josie's story touched you, even in the smallest way, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video so that every day you can discover more stories worth hearing. We would truly love to know how today's story made you feel. So please leave a comment and tell us what you think from the deepest place in your heart, because every feeling you share is read and treasured by us. We wish everyone watching this video lasting good health, a joyful life, and days filled with genuine peace. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.